I write about gadgets for people with money to spend. I consider this my first real job. It feels good to have one place to go 5 days a week, to see the same faces, to receive a steady paycheck. It's been a year, and among many other things, I've learned that journalists love to gossip. I'm not immune. I love it too. Maybe gossip isn't the right word. We merely enjoy talking about each other. What's that, if not some form of affection? I don't understand or like the reporters who don't do it. They're the less driven ones, the ones too oblivious or too precious for the job, the ones who want to be friendly with everyone, as if that doesn't also make them untrustworthy to most. It's part of our work description, trading information for information, leveraging vulnerability to gain trust, determining not only who knows what, but also how to coax those people into telling. Our office is its own microcosm of drama. It gives me almost everything I need to feel part of the world. My title is Consumer Technology Reporter. Everything we do in life matters, said the tech billionaire to the famous portrait photographer. The photographer chose an angle to make the man's head and hands look disproportionately gigantic. A leader, a genius. He was already a very large man. He stared off into the distance, making a pensive expression. The photographer asked him to elaborate. How we communicate and interact with society matters, the billionaire continued. How we travel on this very planet Earth matters. We have to realize that no matter how small or large our actions, everything we do matters. The moment you forget that, the moment you put that aside, your life becomes erratic, chaotic. Weeks later, the photographer gave a short talk about his experience working with the titans of tech, in which he drew attention to this particular man as the one who rose above the rest. Exceptional, the photographer said, with a quiver in his voice. The most authentic and soulful person he had ever met. I tell Tim the plan. He is a senior writer, my desk mate, and I think too a friend who might help. How, I'm not sure, except that he is in a better position than me. He squints his eyes at the news. He wears clear-framed glasses and a slicked-back undercut, which make him appear much younger than the father of 3 children that he is. You know you could stay. Let him go alone. Establish yourself. Are you two getting married? Where are these grad programs anyway? You could end up in the middle of nowhere. Then what are you going to do? You're young. You're up and coming. The editors like you. You're at the cusp of your career. What's going to happen if you follow this guy, especially to the middle of nowhere? Might be a different story if you're getting married. My wife, she followed me here, but we were already married. You're not too young. How old are you again? Jesus, you're young. I mean, I got married at 24 and my wife was 21 at the time. That's how it is in the South, though. I don't want to get married, I say. You want to go to the middle of fucking nowhere for a dude you don't even want to marry? I mean, I don't like the institution of marriage in general. Oh, yeah, very San Francisco of you. Look at Adam over there. He's with his girlfriend 16 years, no plans for marriage. Then he just shows up one morning, knocking his desk so we can hear the click of that ring on his finger like, hey, look at me, I got married, happy me. That's going to be you soon enough. That's not the point, I say. What do I do job-wise? Okay, here versus the middle of nowhere. Pretty easy if you ask me. Where's the middle of nowhere? Why do you keep saying that? Fucking Michigan or Indiana. It's possible he could get into school here or in New York City. You better hope so. Tim looks back at his computer where columns refresh themselves in his custom social deck. The words tick down at a steady speed. He is one of those, the ones adept at cultivating a following. So when would you move if you move? He says, still staring at his screen. He clicks, smirks at something. Not until summer. He continues clicking, then begins typing, faster, moving his right hand back and forth between keyboard and trackpad. I go back to looking at my emails. Conversations between us often end this way, abruptly and without ceremony, the courtesy between desk mates. Many minutes later, he turns to me and says, here's what I'm thinking. Don't tell the editors yet. Wait until you know for sure where or if you're even going. OH, office, 2 interns. Where'd you learn to make this? From a photo one of my friends posted on Instagram. Is your friend a chef? Yeah. Do you have a lot of chef friends on Instagram? Yeah, a bunch. Wait, Are they really your friends or just people you found on there? Like, do you really know and care about them? Oh, sure, they're my good friends, and I care a lot about them. They just don't know I exist. Jay works in a lab with scientists and mice. The lab breeds genetic deformities into the mice, bad eyes basically. He observes the rodents, how they handle their disabilities, which ones lead normal mouse lives, which ones become too ill. The goal is to make discoveries that will translate into curing eye diseases in humans. As someone with severe myopia, I should appreciate these small sacrifices for the greater good. He tells me there are protocols for how to humanely kill the animals. These protocols vary based on size and age. One option is to put the mice into a chamber and overexpose them to CO2 until they pass out and die. This is the most standard procedure and relatively efficient, 5 mice at a time. But they struggle for a couple of minutes before dying, and it is terrible to watch. Another is to euthanize the mouse with an overdose of chemical anesthetics, like the pound does with unadoptable strays and lost animals never retrieved. This is painful when administered correctly. This is painless when administered correctly, but gets expensive and time-consuming to perform with each individual mouse. Then there is the option to decapitate the mouse, if it is small enough, with a pair of very sharp scissors. This is cheap and fast. Jay has to lay a sheet of plastic and paper towels on his lab bench to catch the mess. Yes, small sacrifices for the greater good. This is what he wants to do for the next 5 or so years. It's something I can believe in concept, but I would never be able to get my hands bloodied. His title is Research Associate, too. And I'll end there.
All right, thank you so much for reading, especially from the beginning, in part because I think it's one of my favorite first lines that I've read in a really long time. It's actually, I think, like I've memorized it because it just feels so right for this book. People think I'm smaller than I am. Really, the entire book is kind of packed into that first sentence, which seems to be one of the hardest things for a first sentence to do. And I wanted to bring it up because, you know, your novel is one that's made up of discrete parts. I don't know if people could tell based off of the reading where you would kind of make these pauses, but you can kind of see here that, you know, for the most part, the sections are paragraph, maybe, you know, a couple paragraphs long. And I'm always curious, you know, with those novels that feel like they're almost like Jackson Pollock paintings, what did you actually write first? Was it that, you know, amazing first line, or was it something buried in the middle or the end now?
I did actually write that first line first, which is weird to think of looking back on it. I felt very attached to that first line. I will say that it wasn't always the first line of the novel. There were a couple of revisions where I moved something else to the beginning, but very quickly moved it back. Just because it, like you said, it felt like a first sentence that captured sort of like the entire feel of the rest of the novel to come. Not all of that first section remained exactly as it was, but it's probably one of the few sections that stayed at least like fairly close to its first draft.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for whoever said my earrings were clinking against the earphones. I've taken them off. Hopefully that's fixed the issue. I'm glad that you brought up the process of revision. I can only imagine, or actually I kind of hope that you went through a lot of revisions to get a novel as tight and as cohesive as that. I hope you didn't tell me that you wrote this as one draft.
No.
That would break my heart. Can you talk a little bit about what the process revision is for you? I feel like in some ways I'm almost more curious about how writers revise than how they write, because it feels, you know, that's really when you're putting the piece together.
It was, for this book, a very long and arduous revision process, mostly because, well, it was the first time I'd ever written a novel, and because there are these so many discrete parts, so many fragments and vignettes to be working with. Once I moved like one piece to another section of the book, it like messed up everything else around it. So it was like a really horrifying puzzle that I knew there were like the pieces were there. It's like when it's like, I guess I don't even really like puzzles. So this analogy is not amazing, but it would be like working on a puzzle where you don't know what the final image is supposed to look like. So
And like every piece is
yeah.
blue. And they're just like
Yeah.
different shades of blue.
Right, right. It's like an ombre. You're like, what? I saw one of those on Instagram recently. I was like, how is this satisfying? But yeah, when I first started writing it, I was just like writing without very much order or structure in mind. And it wasn't until I had around like 30,000 words of these fragments where I started to actually create an arc. And that's when like a lot of gaps and like sort of like character issues became like more apparent to me. And I filled stuff in, cut like a third of it out. Yeah, so the revision itself was just like continuous throughout, I don't know, for years, I guess.
You could work on this ombre puzzle forever. It's true.
Yeah, I was actually saying that recently, that like at some point I just had to stop and tell myself like, okay, this is as good as I'm going to be able to get it to without like losing my mind.
Right? Yeah, that's like the devil's bargain. It's just like, how do I still feel like good about, you know, this book while feeling like it's polished as can be? Like I still want to
Right.
like it, you know?
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to hear you say that you didn't really necessarily have an arc in mind, that was something that kind of formed after you'd already collected so many words of fragments, because another thing that really impressed me and really engaged me about your book is that it really feels like a mash of kind of all of my favorite, you know, often American novel tropes. We have the kind of corporate wasteland that you start us off with the tech writing, which is just so pitch perfect, and have a lot of questions about that in a moment. And then we go on this extended road trip across America, from California to upstate New York. And that's also, you know, thrilling to get them, you know, to go to all these like really corny monuments like Wall Drug, which I've been to, and they just like skip Mount Rushmore, which I thought was a really funny, you know, turn on that trope. And then we have, you know, the kind of alienated individual, this narrator who is kind of, you know, in some ways feels stranded in upstate New York, doesn't really have a purpose to go, feels like her relationship is suddenly not fitting the way it used to, doesn't understand herself in this, you know, predominantly white and also East Coast landscape, and she's a Northern California girl. And we also then have a trip to the homeland when she goes to China to visit her father. I mean, that's incredible that you have all of the, what most people would spend entire, you know, books on. You've mashed all these trips together. You've created something that feels so new out of these really time-worn and beloved movements. And I was just kind of curious about your process to like put all of those arcs together into, you know, Days of Distraction.
Thank you for saying that, because when I was working on it, I was like, oh, is this like a Frankenstein book where I'm like, office novel, travelogue, like interior, like isolated woman, lost woman. But when I think as I was working on it, I wasn't really like fully conscious that I was like working with these tropes. It's probably something that like came through in the revision and in like what I was drawn to writing about. But as I was, you know, working on it more, I saw that like there was a very clear movement in space. So that's what I sort of like focused on when I was creating like the arc of the story. You know, this movement from like San Francisco to like across the country, to upstate New York, and then to China, and a very short return. But that's sort of gave me a concrete grounding for like the signposts of the novel. And it just happened that like each place sort of maybe took on a certain trope, I guess, like what you're saying. Yeah, it sort of worked out naturally.
Yeah, I think that it makes sense. You know, you use the word movement, and one of the things that really struck me was that this book has like a really tremendous movement forward to it. You're kind of propelled through as the characters also propelled through space. At the same time, you have a narrator who is very much kind of feels like she's stagnating, is maybe like in a moment of depression or at least depressiveness, melancholy. And that was always, you know, the like tip you got in like your first creative writing class. Like, don't write a narrator who like doesn't do anything. Like, your story will not go forward. No one wants to like be stuck, even if you have the most realistic portrayal of it. And so I'm wondering, do you think that, you know, the sense of movement was in some ways a way to kind of counteract the stuckness of your narrator?
Yeah, and I also kind of still think of my the opening of my book, especially like the San Francisco section and the road trip section, as not necessarily like tricks, but like the sections where like I can get the reader invested in the narrator so that when she is stuck and isolated and lost, by that point, I would hope that like the reader feels intimate with the narrator, like cares about the narrator's state of mind enough to like stick with her while she's not really doing that much. At the same time, that section I knew would feel like claustrophobic to me when I was writing it. And if it feels claustrophobic to me, then I'm assuming that would be passed on to the reader. So I wanted to open up the narrative in that section to all of these like historical documents and historical characters. And that was a way to, at least for me, and I would hope for some readers, increase like a bit of the momentum and open up the story beyond the narrator's like isolated, lost, obsessive mindset.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. That, you know, when one story is maybe necessarily stuck, that you start to pull in these historical threads in order to like kind of give another person's life story. And I thought that was a really great, you know, I guess technique is one way to put it, but as a reader, I just thought that was just a great thing to do. I love learning about all the sort of historical stories that you bring in, often having to do around this topic of interracial relationships between Asian American women and white men, because that is the kind of one of the issues that the narrator is working through. You know, she's moved over to New York for her boyfriend Jay. And suddenly these kind of cultural differences that didn't matter quite as much when they were in Northern California suddenly start to clash together. And so I'm kind of interested in how, you know, was it just kind of by fluke that you discovered some of these historical stories? Did you kind of go out sleuthing? I know that you have a background in journalism. Did that kind of reporter hat come on and you just wanted to like find more stories to supplement hers? Or, you know, were there other reasons why you picked the historical stories that you did?
I definitely started with like an open mind to the research. That's sort of like one of my processes to like get at writing a piece of fiction is just doing like a lot of research that's not always productive and doesn't always make it into the work, but at least like makes me feel like I'm doing something. But with this, like as I did more research, certain characters, I mean, it's hard to call them characters since they were real people, but certain historical figures sort of came to the forefront. And some like Yame Kin, who becomes sort of like the main historical figure who the narrator is concerned with, I did kind of find on a fluke. Like I was going in like the New York Times archival machine and just like searching things like Chinese woman, Asian American, like, and choosing like 1852 to 1902, and clicking on like whatever interested me. And I found an article about her and how she was the first Chinese woman to work for the USDA and had introduced tofu to the United States, which good for her and good for all of us. But I think what struck me was that she was somebody who did so much in her life and had accomplished so much, but I'd never heard of her. And she is largely lost to history. So I knew that I was going to incorporate historical elements and historical narratives into the book. I just didn't know exactly how I was going to do it until I was working on that Ithaca section a little bit more. And I realized, oh, well, this form and this narrator makes it actually very easy for me to like directly give this sense of discovery and research to the character. So it was, yeah, it was a little bit lucky, I guess, since I think in maybe more traditional forms, you have to like explain like every instance of a historical
Yes.
character. But here it was like I only had to explain like in the beginning, and then they could just start getting injected into the narrative.
Yeah, I mean, I love hearing in some ways the kind of free form style that you had in doing the research and putting it together. I think it comes through in the book because nothing about it feels labored to me. It just there's a fluidity to it that it really does feel like you're kind of being sucked into a current. And I loved also hearing the way that you research. It feels very accessible. Like I've never heard a writer describe research, one, in such concrete terms, and two, in terms that I could actually go ahead and do. So thank you for that. I do really feel like, some of the richest writing comes from writers who do have other things they do besides writing, and can speak with authority about subjects that they besides writing as well. And sometimes that comes through research, sometimes that comes through like professions. And like I mentioned before, I know that you used to be a reporter for Wired. Is that right?
Yeah, Wired.
Yeah.
And a couple other places before Wired.
And I was just wondering if, either that experience or just other parts of your life ended up kind of impacting this novel and making it more than a novel about writing or a novel about someone who's kind of writing something, which is something that your narrator is kind of putting together.
Yeah, I mean, my time as a tech journalist definitely infused the novel with that world and that space that I think when I started writing this book, I missed. Um, Even though I have like a complicated relationship to that time period in my life. But I think, even though it's a complicated relationship, it's one that was really formative to like how I perceive myself. And also it was like like I said, and like the narrator says, sorry, in the book, sometimes I do that. But like the narrator says, that is her first job, and something about having that be like my first job, the first job that I consider like my real, like maybe like career path in my early 20s felt really important to me. And it was a world that was really exciting and new and felt really important to me. Like I was doing something that really mattered, whether or not that's actually true. But it's like a fascinating world, the world of tech journalism. So I wanted to write a little bit about that in the book. And also, it's not maybe as fascinating or interesting, but like being a freelance writer who's stuck at home, which I think like a lot of people are now, understanding like that kind of like trapped feeling of like working from home, but also these weird freedoms that you have when you're not having to go to an office and like engage with other people. That was something that I experienced for the first time in when I moved to Ithaca in like 2013. So it was a weird transition to like go from a crowded office space to like being a lonely person at your desk in like, in your living room or in your bedroom.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the things that you capture so well that I'm realizing I maybe haven't just read as much in other books is you think you captured the feeling of burnout really, really well. And part of that is your ability to move through time and to so well articulate the kind of rush of finding that big scoop. You have this fantastic section where the narrator, remembers the first big break that she got as a writer. And just like, I felt that invigoration. And it's amazing because oftentimes something that happens as a reader. You sometimes will judge characters. You'll see somebody who's, not happy at work, and you'll just be like, well, why don't you quit?
Yeah.
Meanwhile, like, you're complaining about your job like every single day. And that was really what was fantastic, is that I could absolutely understand, because of that section, because of the way that you structure the rest of that narrator's work life. I understood, yes, why this person's burnt out, how this corporation has burned her out, how the sense of being devalued and also the sense of maybe one day being valued are like constantly in tension for her. I just loved all of that so much. It made me really glad that for the most part I haven't been within the workplace that's put me under those pressures, because I know immediately I would get sucked into it. And in general, I thought that, and you read a little bit of this with the dialogue with Tim, that you just have this fantastic ear for voice and the way that people speak. And I was wondering, if you could speak a little bit about how you got some of the voices of these characters down. They're all seen through the narrator, and yet all your characters outside the narrator seem just as real and fleshed in. What was that experience of, writing that first person point of view, but still having characters feel alive?
I think I'm drawn to first person narrators who are observant and who sort of I guess like engage with other characters and sort of maybe sometimes erase themselves a little. I mean, like, to the most extreme might be like the Rachel Cusk trilogy narrators, where she like almost says nothing in the books. My narrator, does say a lot more and thinks a lot more, but when she's engaging with other characters, is very attuned to like what they're doing and what they want and how she should behave in relation to them. And I think that's something that, I can relate to as a person in the world. And in terms of how I captured those characters' voices, yeah, I'm not sure. I like eavesdropping on people's conversations. I like listening to people's tics, like speech tics, and trying to capture that on the page, not necessarily replicate it exactly, but to get that feeling of the way they speak in the dialogue. It's something that I find fun in
Yeah,
writing.
absolutely. I heard this somewhere recently, that like all good writers have a great ear, and I at first
Mhm.
didn't understand what that meant, because like I can't do accents, for example. Like I'll try and do a British
Me
accent, it
neither.
becomes something awful. But the more I thought about it, the more I was like, I think, having a good ear can mean cadence, it can be rhythm, it can be just like finding that quirk, finding that pattern. And I think that that is a pattern in like all writers that I see, that there is some kind of fixation on how words come out of somebody's mouth. And I, was especially drawn towards, one character's voice in particular, the narrator's good friend from the Office, Jasmine. Jasmine is, I mean, she's a character that like all readers and all writers love, like the character that just says the thing that she probably shouldn't be saying, but that we all want her to say. And she's never really wrong. It's like wrong time, wrong place, usually not wrong content, which is just like what you want. And it's so interesting that you say that you have a narrator who in some ways maybe mimics others, or kind of, fades back a little bit and lets someone else take the lead. And I saw that especially in her, kind of relationship with Jasmine, who's also Asian American, and the way that they kind of complain about The Office. And I just, in general, am just personally curious about, how Jasmine came about. She seems such a great foil for the narrator, but how did you kind of picture her first?
Yeah, Jasmine, it was really fun to write, especially
I
like
bet.
especially as like breaks from the narrator, because the narrator is so, I mean, one of her flaws, especially throughout the novel and like but especially early on, is that she remains silent in so many situations where she feels uncomfortable, or where she doesn't or where she wants something but doesn't speak up for herself. And Jasmine is basically the opposite of that, where she says a lot and says what she wants to say, and like will put up a fight, and has like a different mentality in terms of like how to approach the people around her.
Mm-hmm.
So she was just like a fun character to write. And I thought of her as, I mean, she was definitely inspired by like a few people who, you know, I've encountered in the workspace and like in academia. But also I thought of her as like a version of myself, like later on, too. So actually, when I thought about Jasmine and the narrator, I thought often of Toni Morrison's Sula. And I remember when we were reading Sula in grad school, what my professor, George Saunders, was like, who is Toni Morrison in these characters? Well, Toni Morrison is all of the characters. She's like every single one of them. There's like pieces of her in all of them. And especially with the narrator and Jasmine, I was like, okay, the narrator is like this version, like a fictionalized version of myself when I was in my early 20s and like scared and like more worried about like my position in the world. And Jasmine is, you know, inspired by like a few people that I know and myself later in life, where I felt like more confident to just say how I felt. Of course, she's a lot more dramatic, I think, than I would even dare to be. But
10 more years. Give it 10 more years.
yeah, I know. But I was thinking about that because I was like in a park recently, and this woman, she's like in her 50s, and she was like, I'm an old lady. I can say whatever I want to say. And I was like, yeah, I want to get there.
I know. I have so much like locked up in here that I can't wait to just like spew out into the world. I just want to give a quick heads up to people that soon we'll start opening it up to the rest of the chat. But I have a couple more questions that I want to get out there, but just so that people start thinking of something great to ask Alexandra. So, you know, I really like hearing the way that you've explained how I think it's true that writers tend to imbue traits of theirs to each of, you know, their characters, almost like you're kind of like a fairy godmother, and you're like, you will get my generosity, you will get my temper. I'm interested in, you know, hearing the ways in which maybe the narrator. So I think like there are some autobiographical elements to your book. The narrator herself is actually called Alexandra at some point. And so I'm sure you've gotten a lot of questions about, right, like what is the auto fiction of it and of it all. And I think you can absolutely answer that. But I'm also a little bit more interested in just in general, you've mentioned that the narrator is maybe a version of you in your early 20s. But do you find that the voice that the narrator speaks in is also the voice that you hear in your head? Or did you go for a narrator who actually sounds very different from the way that your thoughts work?
I am not really sure all the time how the thoughts in my head sound. So it's hard to say. But when I was writing her voice and like the way that she thinks and the way at least she speaks to herself, I was drawing a lot, I guess, on like the way I talk to myself, but then it felt like in revision, in I guess the way that it was like going onto the page, it shifted and became, I think, oftentimes a lot more sparse and clipped maybe than like how I would actually speak to myself in my own head. But it still felt natural. That's the thing. It's like it's different than like how I actually think, and but it felt natural to write when I did write in her voice. Right. Yeah, I've gotten that question of like how did you come up with the voice, and it's such a hard question to answer because it's hard to pinpoint like when the creation of that voice happened. But once it did, it was sort of like, okay, here we go. And it's easy to stick with. Right. It didn't feel like writing somebody who felt totally different from me.
Right. I mean, it must have been very interesting with a first person narrator who also, you know, in some ways shares identity parts with you. I found that whenever I write the early drafts of things, my characters just sound so flat and so puppet-like, and it's just really discouraging at first. And I'm wondering if like that's even a thing that happens when you have a narrator who in some way sounds like you. Can you have a narrator that sounds like a puppet version of you? Is that what it felt like at first ever?
I think maybe at certain points, yes, like especially like when I was writing new sections to like fill in the gaps of the previous sections that were like rearranged into their arc. But initially, it didn't feel that way, probably because of the fragmented form where it's like, this is amusing and here's like a scene.
Mm-hmm.
I find that that happens to me too when I like am writing short stories that have like a very like linear storyline where I'm like, okay, I'm establishing character and I'm establishing like
Mm-hmm.
plot and I'm establishing like the scene and the situation. But since this was like so based around voice initially, it did not feel like a puppet version of myself. Um, but I will say that later on, like when I was like sort of pushing the narrator to do new things and to like put her in different situations, there were moments where I was like, wait, who is this? Who is this character? Like, what does she want? How would she react in this situation? Because like I started to feel distant from her.
Mm-hmm.
Not distant like I didn't know what I think like distant in the sense that like she started to feel like very separate from me. So I had to like re-engage with like what she wanted.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. And like you are giving me, again, really great inadvertent advice of what I'm going to do in the future. Because I think that you're absolutely right that in some ways the linear trap maybe forces you into embodying a character before you really get to know them, instead of focusing on the sparks of light where you do see a person really clearly, which is not when they're walking to the bodega and then having a conversation with the bodega man, even if that is a necessary thing that your story needs to do to move it forward. You're not really going to see the character in those moments. And yet, so that puppetness kind of makes sense. And it reminds me of an author who told me that she wrote her entire book for a while just in like snippets of scenes, right? Like, so a scene from this character when she's age 7, and then the next thing she writes, the character is 25, is a scene at a wedding now. Okay, now the character's 13, different scene. And each of the scenes are just like, here's a moment where this character comes alive for me, where I see them. And then through, all of those disparate scenes, then, okay, yeah, we can maybe tie an arc together. And I think that's just, for me personally, I think that's going to be a much more efficient and like soul-saving way to write characters and define characters, is to not force them into a plot before I know who they are.
Yeah. Actually, now that I'm hearing you distill sort of that advice, I'm like, that's what I should do again going forward. I feel like, I'm not sure if you feel this way, but like every new project, it's like, wait, I don't know how to do this anymore. I don't know how to write anymore.
Mm-hmm.
What did I do before? And now I'm like, oh, okay, wait, I did that before and it worked. Maybe I should try it again.
Yeah, I've literally been trying to reverse engineer the process of the first book with the second one, like down to, I was like, okay, I've got this many pages. That's when I showed someone last time for them to tell me it's not a book yet. So now I'm going to go and show someone who can now tell me I'm not on the right track. And that's pretty much been what I've been trying to reverse engineer. I mean, the question of like what's next is always an interesting one. You can feel free to answer that if you do have something that you're working on, or if you maybe just want to talk about the process of writing in general, or doing something creative in general after turning in a big project like this.
I am under contract for a short story collection, which is going to come out. I keep on saying like late 2021, early 2022, but I actually have no idea because I haven't turned it in yet. So I need to be working on that. Yeah. But those stories are like, they range from like, 6 to 7 years old to stories that like I need to still finish. So it's interesting to like look at these pieces that I wrote at a time period where I feel like, I was a different kind of writer, and maybe I had different ideas about what a story should do, and have that be in the same collection as like stuff that I'm writing now is interesting. And then I have sort of just recently, like last week, started something that maybe could be a novel. So
Yes.
hesitant to say. I mean,
Put
it
as
took
many modifiers as you need to protect
yeah,
it. Protect
possibly.
that.
I'm not sure. Yeah. Uh, but we'll see. It's for me, it's been hard to work on something new after this book.
Mhm.
Maybe because I don't know. It just feels like such a strange experience because this book was with me for so long, and now I'm still like processing that it's out in the world and people can read it. Um, and that feels almost like a hindrance for me to like start something new because I'm still thinking
Mhm.
about how this is like still a new thing that's out in the world. I don't
Mhm.
know. Did you feel like it was hard? I'm like very curious to hear.
100%, 100% hard. Made harder because the advice that I kept getting, and I think it was well-intentioned advice, is that you should start your next book before your first book comes out.
Yeah, I did not
Have you
do
heard
that.
that?
Yeah, I heard that a lot and I was like, it's not possible.
And it just added even more anxiety because I was like, I don't know what, so I'm just gonna like keep trying and bang my head against ideas that like are obviously not ones that I'm interested in. Um, but what I came to understand about myself, and this might be the same for you since you seem to also be a fairly observational writer, is that, I thought because the book that I wrote was not autobiographical, that I still had like my well for creativity was still full. Like I could use all my stuff from childhood, that should like fill up at least 7 more books. But in fact, the well happened dried up because all those observations that I collected over those years had all gone in, like from anywhere to like how the clouds looked one day to like a really bad pair of shoes that I saw. I think like all those interesting details had to go into the book. And it wasn't until, like maybe a year and a year and a half had passed that I felt like there was even something for me to observe. Like I really
Mm,
felt in some ways like kind of like my senses had been numbed. And I think it was just a little bit of maybe like a version of writer burnout, where I was just like, I'm tired
yeah.
of noticing things. I just want to live.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think I am still in that stage where I'm like, let me just like well, I don't know. Not that I'm like going out and living right now. I'm like, let me
Right.
play Animal Crossing for 4 hours and observe like the way these flowers change. Maybe this will feed into my writing one day. Um, yeah, that's actually comforting to
Yeah,
hear.
it 100% will help your writing one day. I think there's so many Animal Crossing novels.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
So right now, like you say, like you're revisiting stories that you wrote like a couple of years back. They're like older stories. Is that one of the situations that you're in for the
Yeah, one
collection?
of them. I
Mhm.
think, I mean, the stories that were published and were older, I'm just not even bothering to
Mhm.
look at anymore. I'm like, it's okay. I feel like from journalism maybe too that I learned this thing where it's like it's gone, it's published. There's like no reason to touch it again. I've heard of writers who will like look at their older stories or even when they have like a collected story collection um, from like all of their stories across like the past 20 years, they'll edit
Mhm.
their work and I'm like, no, I can't do that. I'm
Yeah.
okay with like what happened and this is just like a representation of like what or who I was as a writer at that point in time.
Mhm.
I think it's more of like a process mentality than product
Mhm.
mentality.
Mhm.
But there are some old stories that were never published.
Yeah.
And so now I'm like, okay, maybe those stories could use a little bit more work. But I,
Mhm.
again, feel, I don't know. I read an old story and I'm like, what was I even thinking? Sometimes
Mhm.
I'm like, I have no idea what I was thinking and I don't know what I wanted out of the story. And then other times I'm like, wow, I was such a great writer back then. Why can't I do this in a new story? So it's these like this conflict of engaging with past work
Yeah. I mean, like
that I'm currently in.
your book already made me feel like we have lived parallel experiences because they're just things that you bring up. I'm just like, get out of my head. But what you're saying now, I'm also just like, I've had those exact same thoughts. I really click with that. And, I was asking that question because I think it must be such delicate surgery for the reasons that you explained to go back to those older stories, because even if your technique has gotten better, right, through practice, um, the emotional heart of that story is in some ways like caged in the story, but you can't really feel where it is anymore. And so even as you're trying to edit, you're also trying not to edit the heart out.
Yeah.
And I have done that thing. I've had that hubris to go back to stuff that I published when I was so young, and I'm like, well, now I can make this perfect, and then I'll do all these edits, and I think I'll make it great, and I'll reread it. I'm just like, oh, I killed it. Oh, it's dead. It's fully dead on the table. And I wish you a lot of luck in trying to figure out where that heart is. But I think like already your lack of ego about it makes me think that you're gonna have a great time of like rediscovering the heart of those stories.
Yeah, we'll see. At least that's my state of mind right now. When I'm alone, like with my computer and my old stories, I'll be in a different state of mind.
Oh, it looks like we do have a question coming in. So Mary asks, do you usually work alone, or are you a member of a writer's community?
I have worked mostly alone these past couple of years, while keeping in touch with like a couple of readers who I met through the MFA program at Syracuse, which I graduated from in 2018. And I do think community is really important. But I have found that having like one or two trusted readers is a lot more helpful and meaningful to me than having like, sending something out to like 5 people whose feedback is varied in terms of like how helpful it is to me. Mm-hmm. So mostly alone now though, because I don't want to share the stuff that I'm working on. I'm too embarrassed about it.
And then we have Lindsay, who asks, do you prefer writing short stories or that longer form, the novel?
Because I've only written one novel, I want to say that I prefer short stories because I've written more of them. But I do find it hard to return to the short story after having written this novel. And I think that's why I started something that I can already see could turn into a novel, just because I'm like, oh, there's like 8 to 10 different characters and they're all going to do these different things. Like I'm going to write something that's totally different from my first novel, but also has like a longer form. I'm not sure. Did you find it hard to return to short stories? Because everything suddenly expands. Like I'm like, okay, it will be one incident. Yeah. But then I'm like, oh, but then they go over here and then they go over there and then they actually want this other thing too. And I'm like, oh no, I'm doing that novel thing where it's becoming too big and too messy.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I felt that. And it used to be something that I prided myself on when I was writing predominantly short stories, is that I would always know the cadence of like, it's going to wrap up by 15 to 18 pages, regardless of what, I don't even know what the story is going to be. And yet like I had it in my like muscles in some ways, that I just knew that last paragraph was going to come, page 15, page 18, maybe page 20. It was never going to get longer than that. And yeah, the writing the novel totally broke that mechanism in me, and I'm pissed off about it because like I didn't know I could lose it. And yeah, everything has just it's just like dough that's already expanded. There's no way to like fit it back in. And the closest that I've come is in some ways revisiting older short stories, and that form, that cadence has already been set, and then I can just kind of like fluff around with it. And I'm, not as tempted to add more things to it. But I do miss that short story form, because it is, I feel like, because there's just that one big event that's supposed to disrupt everything, it always felt so powerful to write a short story, because you're just like, I'm going to fuck shit up for everyone. Yeah. And that's like, in novels, for whatever reason, that instinct goes away. And I'm just like, let's just let it do a slow burn. And everyone around me is like, no, make stuff happen. Right. I'm like, no, wait another 100 pages. I got time.
Yeah, no, that's totally true. I've been trying to read like more short stories just to like get that feeling back. And I think that's part of the reason why too I haven't been able to return to the short story successfully, because I've been reading novels for so long. I'm like, wait, I need to like read a bunch of short stories and see how these like short story masters like condense something. And yeah, I'm just realizing, oh yeah, compression and like ellipses, like skipping over a lot of stuff, that's okay in a short story. You don't need to explain like the exact movement from one place to another, which is like what I felt like I did a lot of the time in the novel.
It's like scooching someone forward, like they're like a
Yeah.
shy kid, and like, no, no, keep going. um, well, it looks like we're also kind of at the clock of our event. It's been so wonderful to be able to chat with you. I just had a sense from reading your novel that we would have a lot to talk about, and it's just been a really pleasurable hour for me. I hope that other people were also interested eavesdropping on our conversation, and participating in the chat as well. And yeah, I'm going to turn over to Bennett, but first, just buy Alexandra's book. It's an amazing book. I love it so much, and I think that you'll inhale it in a weekend. So yeah, just go ahead and buy her book.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lillian, for moderating that awesome conversation and Q&A. Thank you, Alexandra, for stopping by and giving us that lovely reading and just, spending some time with us. Thank you to all of you for tuning in. We had 32 of you tonight, which is like so awesome to me that we can still gather and get to hear about a really phenomenal book. If you're not familiar, or excuse me, if you haven't bought Days of Distraction yet, please do so. It's available through our web store. And of course, if you haven't read Number One Chinese Restaurant by Lillian Li, feel free to pick that one up too. It's another great read. So thank you so much again for dropping by, everybody, and hopefully we'll see you all soon.